The date is April 26, 1986. The time 1:23 a.m., in the heart of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a routine safety test was underway at Reactor Unit 4. It was a test conducted by engineers, not physicists, designed to check if the plant's massive turbines could still generate power to run essential cooling pumps during a temporary electrical failure. What began as a mundane, required procedure quickly spiraled into the most catastrophic technological disaster in human history, an event that would irrevocably alter global energy policy and fundamentally undermine the foundation of the Soviet Union. The fatal instability was rooted deep within the Soviet system itself. The reactor involved, the RBM-1000, was a uniquely Soviet design, powerful, cost-effective, and, crucially, inherently flawed. It possessed what is known as a positive void coefficient, meaning that, as the water coolant turned to steam, the nuclear reaction accelerated rather than slowed down. This design flaw was well known to Soviet nuclear physicists, but information about it was actively suppressed from plant operators, deemed a state secret to preserve the farce aid of Soviet technological superiority. This deliberate concealment of critical safety information set the stage for disaster. The operators on duty that night, confident in their procedural checklists, made a series of critical, compounding errors. They violated safety protocols by operating the reactor at dangerously low power levels and overriding automated safety mechanisms that would have shut down the reactor. They were, unknowingly, wrestling with a flawed machine using incomplete instructions, acting within a culture that prioritized production targets and adherence to procedure over questioning safety. The final act was the pressing of the emergency shutdown button, the AZ-5, intended to fully halt the reaction. Instead, due to the RBMK's graphite-tipped control rods, this action resulted in the final, massive power surge that guaranteed catastrophe. The resulting steam explosion was not a conventional nuclear blast, but a massive pressure wave that instantly blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid clean off the top of the building, exposing the core to the atmosphere. A second, more powerful explosion followed seconds later, rupturing the pressure channels and sending superheated graphite and nuclear fuel into the night sky. The air quickly became contaminated with an invisible, deadly plume of highly radioactive materials, including iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90. These dangerous elements were carried on the wind, spreading the unseen poison far beyond the plant's immediate vicinity. In the control room, the operators were in a state of confusion, disbelief, and shock. They initially failed to grasp the scale of the damage, reporting only a fire and minor damage to the roof. The very idea that the massive reactor core could have exploded was considered physically impossible, according to official Soviet doctrine. This initial denial, rooted in the political and scientific dogma of the Soviet system, was the first, most immediate, and most catastrophic form of the Chernobyl cover-up. The system's innate need to appear flawless and infallible ensured that the initial response was one of confusion and minimized reporting, condemning the local population to agonizing exposure. Following the violent explosions, the disaster entered its critical phase, the Soviet government's reflexive cover-up. From the moment the first report reached Moscow, the highest echelons of the Communist Party hierarchy initiated a policy of total silence and denial, driven by a deep-seated fear of internal panic, external embarrassment, and a desire to protect the image of the technologically superior Soviet state. The truth was not just suppressed. It was officially classified as a state secret. The nearby city of Prypiat, home to nearly 50,000 workers and their families, lay just 3 kilometers from the burning reactor. Within hours, citizens reported a metallic taste in their mouths, a strange luminescence in the air, and a severe burning sensation in their eyes. Yet, the local party officials and plant managers, adhering to the culture of secrecy, offered no warning and no instruction. Life in Prypiat continued as normal that Saturday morning, with children playing outdoors and residents going about their chores, unaware they were being subjected to lethal doses of radiation equivalent to tens of thousands of chest X-rays. Crucially, the decision to delay the evacuation of Prypiat was deliberate and devastating. Despite knowing the magnitude of the radiation release by the evening of April 26, the central government refused to authorize an immediate evacuation. The official line prioritized maintaining order and suppressing panic over safeguarding public health. The evacuation of Prypiat did not begin until the afternoon of Sunday, April 27, a full 36 hours after the explosion. This agonizing delay was fatal, ensuring maximum exposure to the rapidly decaying but highly dangerous iodine-131, which was consumed by the population through contaminated air and food, setting the stage for a future epidemic of thyroid cancers. While Moscow remained stubbornly silent, the disaster was announced to the world not by the Soviet Union, but by its neighbors. On the morning of Monday, April 28, technicians at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, detected alarming levels of radiation on their clothing. Using air currents and meteorological data, they quickly traced the source back to the USSR. The Swedes, realizing the catastrophic nature of the accident, publicly issued a global alert. Only then, forced into a corner by irrefutable external evidence, did the Soviet news agency TASS issue a terse, 4-sentence statement that acknowledged "on accident" and spoke of minor damage. This forced admission was a profound humiliation and the first crack in the iron curtain of secrecy. The immediate concealment was not merely passive, it was an active campaign of disinformation. Official radiation readings published internally were deliberately falsified, reporting figures that were often a mere fraction of the true, measured radiation levels. Soviet medical personnel were instructed to avoid mentioning radiation or nuclear in their records, using vague diagnoses like vegetative dystonia. This initial impulse to conceal the truth, characteristic of the deeply secretive Soviet regime, cost countless lives and permanently destroyed the state's moral authority.
Peace, labor, May! Peace, labor, May! Hooray!
Perhaps the most morally indefensible act of the entire cover-up was the Soviet government's decision regarding the May Day celebrations, the most important civic holiday in the USSR. On May 1, 5 days after the explosion, the capital of the Ukrainian SSR, Kyiv, located only 100 kilometers downwind of the burning reactor, was already receiving significant radioactive fallout. The party leadership in Moscow and Kyiv were fully aware of the dangerous radiation levels present in the city. Despite this knowledge, the authorities proceeded with the traditional May Day parade. This event, a massive, highly choreographed display of Soviet strength and unity, involved thousands of citizens, including enormous numbers of schoolchildren, marching for hours through the city center. This decision was a grotesque sacrifice of public health for the sake of political optics. The aim was simple: to project an image of calm, control, and normalcy to the world, and more importantly, to the Soviet people, denying the reality of the crisis that was engulfing them. The government was willing to expose hundreds of thousands of its own citizens, particularly the vulnerable children, to carcinogenic fallout rather than admit to a catastrophe. The decision was not accidental. It was a clear display of the party's hierarchy of values, where political legitimacy trumped human life. Soviet officials feared that cancelling the parade would be seen as an admission of extreme danger, potentially triggering panic across the USSR and providing anti-Soviet propaganda for the West. For the participants in Kiev, this meant hours spent outdoors, unknowingly breathing in radioactive particulates and receiving unnecessary doses of radiation. This event became a symbol of the party's callous indifference and its willingness to enforce a deadly lie. The cover-up extended beyond just the parade. Officials in Kiev and other downwind areas were actively forbidden from informing the public about the need for basic protective measures. Citizens were not advised to take iodine prophylaxis, which could have saturated the thyroid and blocked the uptake of radioactive iodine, 131. Nor were they told to remain indoors, keep windows closed, or cease consuming local produce and fresh milk. This failure to communicate basic protective measures directly contributed to the subsequent epidemic of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents in the region, a direct, measurable health consequence of the government's systematic deception. Internally, party directives ensured that the truth remained hidden. All information regarding radiation levels, contamination, and the health of the population was immediately classified as a state secret. The official narrative remained fixed. The West was exaggerating the scale of the minor accident for political gain, and the situation was completely under control. This pervasive, top-down secrecy ensured that the population was left defenseless against an invisible, deadly enemy. The May Day parade stands as a historical marker of the moment the Soviet system's deep-seated culture of deception led to the unforgivable betrayal of its own people. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the Soviet response shifted from denial to a massive, desperate deployment of human resources known as the Liquidators. These were the hundreds of thousands of military reservists, firefighters, miners, engineers, and ordinary citizens conscripted from across the Soviet Union and sent to the Chernobyl exclusion zone to clean up the disaster. Their heroic, yet ultimately tragic, role in containing the catastrophe was essential, but their service was deeply tainted by the ongoing government cover-up. The liquidators were tasked with the impossible: extinguishing the graphite fires, clearing highly radioactive debris from the reactor roof, constructing the initial protective sarcophagus over the destroyed Unit 4, and decontaminating the surrounding area. Many worked under terrifying conditions, sometimes with radiation levels reaching lethal doses within minutes. In the absence of functional robots, which often failed due to the extreme radiation, thousands of men were sent onto the reactor roof for short, frantic shifts, shoveling graphite blocks into the gaping hole by hand. These men became known as bio-robots. A key element of the cover-up was the deliberate misinformation regarding radiation exposure. Many liquidators were not informed of the true risks they faced, nor were they provided with adequate protective gear. Often, they were issued rudimentary clothing and simple paper masks that offered virtually no defense against alpha and beta radiation. Furthermore, their official dosimeter readings were frequently tampered with or simply recorded incorrectly by supervising officers to prevent panic and, critically, to keep the official exposure statistics below maximum allowable levels. thus minimizing government liability and avoiding the political embarrassment of having too many citizens receive life-threatening doses. The consequence of this systemic deception was profound. Over 600 Zerolos and liquidators were exposed to significant levels of radiation. While the official number of deaths among them is notoriously low, the vast majority suffered long-term health consequences, including cancers, debilitating immune disorders, and cardiovascular issues. For many, their service was a death sentence delivered slowly, often accompanied by the shame of being disbelieved by a system that actively worked to suppress the truth of their exposure. The Soviet state, while honoring their heroism in propaganda, was simultaneously erasing the true cost of their sacrifice in the official record. The liquidators' legacy is one of unparalleled courage and ultimate betrayal. They successfully contained the core crisis, preventing further radiation releases and mitigating the initial danger. Yet, they were sacrificed to protect the image of the Soviet state. The failure to accurately track, inform, and care for these men stands as one of the most damning indictments of the Chernobyl cover-up. The sheer number of people damaged by the state's reckless disregard for their safety highlights the brutal efficacy of the Soviet system of secrecy when applied to human life. The Chernobyl disaster occurred during a pivotal moment in Soviet history, the early tenure of General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. He had risen to power in 1985 with a mandate for reform, famously championing the twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. The cover-up of the nuclear disaster placed Gorbachev's ambitious reforms and the credibility of the entire Soviet system under immense, immediate scrutiny, testing the very limits of his promises. Gorbachev's initial reaction was typical of the old guard: denial and secrecy. He did not publicly address the nation about Chernobyl until May 14, 1986, nearly 3 weeks after the explosion. When he finally did speak, his address was defensive, laced with accusations that Western media was sensationalizing the event and using it as a tool for anti-Soviet propaganda. This initial response showed the deep, ingrained instinct of the Soviet bureaucracy to conceal failure and resist any admission of systemic weakness. The initial reflex of the Soviet system proved stronger than the leader's reformist ideals. However, the sheer magnitude of the disaster and the irrefutable evidence provided by external sources ultimately forced Gorbachev's hand. The Chernobyl cover-up became a massive, undeniable roadblock to his policy of glasnost. How could he champion openness when the state was actively lying about the health and safety of millions? The crisis became a turning point, forcing a slow, painful, and partial embrace of transparency, simply because the scale of the catastrophe made total concealment impossible. The disaster proved that the old system could not survive. The cover-up's failure to prevent the truth from leaking out severely damaged the credibility of the Soviet government, both domestically and internationally. Scientists, intellectuals, and even some mid-level party officials, witnessing the official lies and the suffering of the population, grew increasingly disillusioned. The disaster gave moral weight to reformist and nationalist movements within the republics, providing a powerful, unifying symbol of Soviet incompetence and indifference to local populations. In the subsequent years, the partial admission of guilt and the establishment of more transparent investigations, though slow and often reluctant, became a critical step in the disintegration of the Soviet Union. As Gorbachev later admitted, Chernobyl was more significant than the August coup, Higher of 1991 that brought down the Soviet Union. He recognized that the disaster and the state's catastrophic handling of the fallout exposed the system's lies, eroded public trust beyond repair, and provided a permanent, moral justification for the collapse of Soviet power. The Chernobyl cover-up was a political and moral earthquake from which the USSR never recovered. While the immediate suppression of radiation data was tragic, the Soviet government's long-term health cover-up proved to be an equally devastating act of bureaucratic negligence and deception. This systematic effort focused on obscuring the true public health consequences of the fallout, particularly the link between radiation exposure and subsequent illnesses. The goal was to minimize liability, prevent mass panic, and protect the official low death toll figures. The core of this deception centered on the thyroid cancer epidemic. Radioactive iodine-131, released in massive quantities during the first few days, has a half-life of only 8 days, but is highly effective at causing cancer, especially when concentrated in the thyroid glands of children and adolescents. The government's failure to distribute iodine prophylaxis as potassium iodide tablets, and its delay in advising against consuming contaminated milk guaranteed that this vulnerable population received maximum internal doses. In the years following the disaster, medical and epidemiological data were systematically manipulated, suppressed, or simply categorized vaguely to obscure the true cause of death and illness. Doctors and scientists were actively discouraged from linking illnesses, particularly cancers, to radiation exposure from Chernobyl. Diagnoses were often changed from specific cancers to general, non-radiation-related terms. This was a classic tactic of the Soviet system. If the official statistics did not show a problem, then the problem, officially, did not exist. Furthermore, the government made a concerted effort to downplay the official exposure figures. In subsequent decades, a new policy was adopted to define the Chernobyl death toll as only the immediate deaths that occurred in the first few weeks, primarily from acute radiation syndrome (CRS). This intentionally narrow definition excluded the thousands of premature deaths from cancers and other illnesses that resulted from long-term exposure, effectively wiping out the majority of the victims from the official record. This statistical manipulation continues to impact international and scientific debates over the true casualty figures to this day. The health cover-up severely impacted the victims. Individuals who suffered from debilitating illnesses often struggled to receive official recognition, proper medical care, or compensation, as the government denied any link between their condition and the disaster. The psychological damage was compounded by the fact that many victims were treated as hypochondriacs or exaggerators by a state intent on controlling the narrative. The long-term health consequences, particularly the staggering increase in thyroid cancer, stand as the most concrete, irrefutable evidence of the cover-up's human cost. The fact that the Soviet government consciously chose to withhold simple, life-saving information, like telling people not to drink local milk, in the days following the explosion, and then spent decades trying to hide the result, is a chilling testament to the regime's fatal priorities. The Chernobyl cover-up thrust the Soviet Union into an unprecedented position of international scrutiny and forced a reluctant engagement with global regulatory bodies. The secrecy and disinformation employed by Moscow not only endangered its own citizens, but also placed neighboring European nations at risk, fundamentally changing the way the world viewed nuclear safety and the Soviet regime. The global alarm, triggered by the radiation detection in Sweden, led to immediate diplomatic fallout. European nations, particularly those in Scandinavia and Central Europe, scrambled to monitor radiation levels, issue food warnings, and protect their populations, all while operating with minimal or falsified data from the USSR. The Soviets' initial lies were so transparent that they severely damaged their diplomatic standing, demonstrating a willingness to endanger international neighbors for the sake of internal political stability. The pressure from international bodies, particularly the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, forced the Soviet Union to open up, albeit slowly and reluctantly. In August 1986, just months after the disaster, the Soviets sent a delegation led by chief designer Valery Legasov to Vienna for a major IAEA conference. Legasov's presentation, which provided relatively detailed information about the cause and sequence of the accident, was a watershed moment. It marked the first time the Soviet Union had ever publicly admitted such a profound technological and operational failure on the world stage. However, even Legasov's presentation was a carefully managed form of partial disclosure. While he revealed the operational errors and some flaws, the most critical design flaw of the RBMK reactor, the positive void coefficient that he was intimately aware of, was glossed over or understated. Legasov, though hailed as a hero for his partial honesty, was still navigating the constraints of the Soviet system, protecting the essential secrets of the military-industrial complex. The internal pressure and guilt eventually led to his tragic suicide exactly 2 years later, a grim testament to the toll the cover-up took on those forced to lie for the state. The international response had lasting consequences for nuclear energy globally. It led to the establishment of stricter international safety standards, increased cooperation in monitoring and data sharing, and a mandatory review of similar reactor types around the world. The Chernobyl cover-up proved that a nuclear accident is never just a domestic issue. It is a global crisis that demands immediate, full transparency. The disaster demonstrated that the Soviet Union's culture of secrecy was incompatible with the management of highly dangerous technology, irrevocably linking the collapse of the nuclear core with the eventual collapse of the Iron Curtain itself. The legacy of the Chernobyl cover-up is not merely a tale of failed technology or poor decision-making. It is a profound indictment of a political system built on secrecy, denial, and the prioritization of ideology over human life. The disaster served as the single most effective, devastating piece of evidence against the Soviet government's long-term claim of superiority and infallibility. The immediate impulse to conceal the explosion was not an isolated error. It was the automatic, inherent response of the Soviet bureaucracy. This culture was rooted in decades of Cold War secrecy, where any failure, whether in space, the military, or civilian technology, was suppressed to maintain the facade of power and to deny propaganda opportunities to the West. The cover-up demonstrated that this reflexive secrecy was fatally incompatible with the reality of a modern, technological state. The system could lie about steel production, but it could not lie about a column of radioactive steam that crossed international borders. The trials that followed, while ostensibly seeking justice, were themselves influenced by the lingering culture of secrecy. The initial focus was placed squarely on the plant operators, particularly Director Viktor Brukhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, scapegoating them for gross incompetence and negligence. While these men were guilty of critical procedural violations, the government successfully deflected attention away from the RBMK reactor's design flaws and the systemic failures of the Ministry of Energy that created the environment for the disaster. The state punished the lower-level operatives to preserve the illusion that the system itself remained sound. Today, the most tangible legacy of the cover-up is the deep and irreparable erosion of trust between the government and the populace in the post-Soviet space. The lies surrounding Chernobyl left generations wary of official information, contributing to persistent skepticism about authority, scientific claims, and state transparency. This loss of faith remains a critical, ongoing challenge for the successor nations, a direct consequence of the state's failure to protect its citizens when they needed it most. The Chernobyl cover-up stands as a unique and permanent historical lesson. It is a chilling reminder that in times of crisis, transparency is not merely a moral virtue, but a public safety imperative. The Soviet regime's deep-seated culture of deception led to the unforgivable betrayal of its own people, costing thousands of lives and ultimately accelerating the collapse of the very empire it was desperately trying to protect. The silence of the Soviet system proved far more deadly than the blast itself.